Amen. Wasn't that amazing? Thank you, chanters. And it had that mysterious quality of, the day that King Solomon had the temple consecrated. There's a part where a cloud of mystery comes. And I imagine they could have been singing a mysterious, reverent song like that. And guess what? They're going to sing again at the offertory time. So with another song that totally ties in with our text and theme today, awesomeness. So welcome to worship. And this week we were studying 1 Kings chapters 5 through 9. So it was a chunk of chapters today. And it was one of those weeks where it was a bit of a slog. I will admit this. So sometimes the Bible is difficult to read because, oh gosh, sometimes there's violence there and you just want to turn away and say, oh my goodness, oh, that's rough. Or sometimes parts of the Bible are just sad. It's hard to read. Oh my gosh, Monday, Thursday, what happens during Holy Week? That's hard. Sometimes the Bible's hard to read because there's this material where you're thinking, who is that? What name is that? Where are they? What ritual is that? You just feel lost because it's the cultural and time difference is so strange. Or you read the book of Revelation, you think, oh, that's pretty weird. So different parts of the Bible are hard to read. This part of the Bible is hard to read for a different reason. You know why? It's like reading the phone book, okay? Now, some of you don't know what a phone book is. I realize that, okay? So there's this thing called a phone book, and many of us grew up with it. Some places still have phone books. So they're, literally a book of phone numbers. So it's a thing. In fact, this summer, my brothers and I were working on a project back at my mom's house, and we needed addresses. And you can't just Google addresses, okay? Sometimes Google is a little imprecise, okay? Or you want to cross-check what you're getting. Is this really the person that we need? Is this really the address we need? So we got out, guess what? The phone book. In my hometown, it's like this big. So we're looking through the phone book and trying to figure out this one person's address, and we found a family member with the same last name. And so it's like, well, here's this family member. So I'm from the big county seat town of 6,000 Independence. And in this county, there's also a town called Rowley, and there's Brandon. And we're noticing, well, the relatives live in Rowley. So maybe she's in Rowley, or maybe it's Brandon. Well, in the entry, the relatives had Rowley. And I'm like, well, they're in Rowley, but she doesn't have Rowley in her listing. So what could that be? And I suddenly had an idea. I think they live in Walker, the big town of Walker nearby. And that was the right answer. So phone books are handy, aren't they? Phone books come in handy even in 2024. Phone books can kind of rescue you. So, even though 1 Kings chapters 5 through 9 is a bit like reading a phone book, there's stuff in there. So I'd like to equip you today, if you happen to read it, to help you read through it in a productive way. Or if you'd rather not read it, I'll give you the highlights. And then also, why is that material there? Why is it there? And I think there's something to be said for why 5, 6, 7, 8, 5 chapters are devoted to, guess what? The building of the temple. And if you're reading it, some of the translations just say house of the Lord, because in Hebrew it just says the word house, house, house. And then they knew it was talking about the house of the Lord. So don't be confused by that. There's the house of the Lord, and then there's other houses that aren't the temple. So if you're in study this week, the other houses aren't the temple. They are Solomon's, his palace, right? His fancy. He gets some buildings too. So, but the central matter is this house of the Lord. So you start reading, and it's kind of cool. At first, it depicts trade and diplomacy. There's this King Hiram who was in Tyre, Phoenicia, what is now present-day Lebanon, and King Solomon and King Hiram make a deal. So it's this beautiful diplomatic trade going on there in the ancient world about 3,000 years ago. And King Hiram has some materials, and they are the building block structure for this project and other projects. And it is the cedars. I was going to say, what's Lebanon famous for, if you've heard this? Cedars. So there's cedars, and it turns out cypress. And then later on, if you read through the whole thing, apparently Hiram had gold that was used in the project. So cool things when you read the phone book section of the Bible, what's going on there. So, wow, diplomatic trade. Other things, and this is the part that, sorry, architects, the next chapter is like blueprints. You know, there's the porch, there's the Holy of Holies, there's the storage, and then what happens on the inside. So, but respectfully, wow, it is fascinating. The plan for this building, the cubits, we got our cubit stick. They didn't use inches and feet, they used cubits. So if you're curious about a cubit, and later on too, if you want to take a peek inside, go for it in our scale model. So, it's the blueprint part, but it's still interesting to see the blueprints and wonder of wonders how they put it together and then they decorated the interior. So we imagine the paneling, the wood, stone was a big part of it. And then the cherub, plural cherubim, that they carved out of olive wood in there, the ornate things like pomegranates, and palm trees. So we just imagine what the landscape looked like that inspired their craftsmanship and artwork. So that's pretty fascinating. It does run on a little long, and it's a little bit repetitive. Along with that is this thread that is said several different times, and it began back in the 1st and 2nd Samuel, which precedes 1st and 2nd Kings. There, King David said, "Oh Lord, I'd like to build you a house." And the Lord said, not yet, son, wait. So there's a big thing about timing. And it might have made David feel bad. Okay, I'm not building a house for the Lord, and the Lord is central to my life, and I'm not doing it. Maybe he had a kind of a guilt trip or history. Look back and say, well, why didn't David build the temple? What was the deal there? Did he not respect the Lord? And so there's this thread of, it wasn't the right time. Okay, King Solomon, go. It's the time now. And they emphasize it was a time of peace. So isn't that an extraordinary thing when, let's speak that truth. When you have peace, it creates the ground for working together, collaboration, and the production of something extraordinary. So we give thanks to God for peace in the world, and we pray for peace anywhere in the world right now that is not experiencing it. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. And finally, there's celebration. When the project's done, took 7 years apparently, there was such a party. So that was the upshot of the reading today from chapter 8 is the party. And what they did when the temple was all finished up, they brought in these sacred things that had been out in the tent of meeting that they had carried with them since Moses' days. They had worshiped in the wilderness and the desert, and they had schlepped along with, in this tent of meeting. They had the ark, and they had some things there, and that had kept them going. So they brought in those things into the temple and said, yay, this is our day. So, and then after they did that, Solomon has a worship service, and he has a prayer, and he assembles people, a big party. And then he asks for God to consecrate, to bless this. And he said, Lord, will you be with us? Will you help us? Can you turn your face toward us? Would you forgive us? Solomon has this beautiful, quite long prayer segment there in chapter 8. And then lo and behold, in chapter 9, did you hear what happened? We even did it during Time for Discovery today. Did you hear who chimed in? The Lord. The Lord said, "Yep, I hear your prayer. Yes, I will be with you." And then the Lord sounds like this refrain that's all through this part of the history of the Bible. The Lord sounds like here's that big word, you ready? It's 6 syllables, Deuteronomistic. The Lord sounds awfully Deuteronomistic. So since we've studied before, some of you have heard that before, it comes from Deuteronomy, and it acknowledges the truth that stuff happened, stories happened, people told the stories, then some people wrote the stories down on scrolls, and then the scrolls got copied and people shared stories, and then scrolls got put together about history and what happened in the Bible. This is the making of the Bible. And then it passed through years and years of usage and editing. And one later stage of editing of these scrolls were a body of people who had this sensibility that scholars now call Deuteronomistic. And there's different parts of the Bible that were different people were custodians of. But this big chunk of history in the Bible, the final editors, there's the material, then these editors came around and kind of added some framework or some theology in there to tee it up in their own viewpoint. And the Deuteronomistic editors had this distinctive phrase. You'll see it if you read through it, Samuel, Kings, other places. If, it's an if-then covenant. If you walk in my ways, if you do these things, if you do these, centering God, then life will be good. If you do not, life won't be so good. So that's part of one of the 2 kinds of covenant in the Old Testament. If you walk in my ways and follow the 10 Commandments and make God, your focus, it'll all go well. And if not, sorry, Charlie. So the Deuteronomistic editors who came along later knew what happened. Because after these glory days of Solomon and the temple and his wisdom and his opulence, actually, the kingdom starts to fall. And so people were puzzled, and there's kind of a post-mortem. What happened? They were at their peak, and then shortly after Solomon, the kingdom breaks in 2, north and south, and then the north gets taken over by the Assyrians, and then eventually the south gets taken over by the Babylonians, and they're carted off into exile. What happened? And the Deuteronomistic final editors, looking back at this time, said, they didn't center God. That's what happened. So they're kind of a shame voice. But it is true. Yes, centering God brings about good things. That is true. But I'm going to throw out there that there's a second covenant in the Old Testament, and it's the everlasting covenant. And you see that in Isaiah, that God will be with us always. And that, of course, human beings are broken. Of course, human beings are going to do wrong. Of course, that's going to happen. We're not going to always walk in the ways of the Lord. Yeah, that's true. And guess what? God will still love us. God will still redeem us. And so that kind of covenant is where Jesus picks up and says, I am with you always. I don't care what you do. That's the covenant we see in the cross, that when people really blew it, including his own disciples and the society and the priests, the Levites, Roman, everybody abandoned Jesus. Did God say, oh, shame, shame, shame? No, our Christian theology says God loved us. God forgave us. So that's the everlasting covenant that is central to Christianity. And, we also know that centering God is the path to happiness. And I was just reading a psalm this week. It was 112. And it's not just Psalm 112. It starts out with, you want to be happy? Center your life on God. Wow, it's so simple. It's so very simple. And yet, it's hard. So I thought today, let's take a moment and go back to the basics. Centering ourselves on God. And not just any God, a God of grace that we know in Jesus Christ. What does it mean to center ourselves, to let that be the focal point of our lives? And when that happens, oh my gosh, healing, peace, wholeness, happiness, the big pursuit of modern life and all human life, when we have God centered. So I think, when am I not experiencing or practicing the centering of God in my life? Then I thought, what am I centering when I'm not centering the God of grace? And I thought, I am centering negative voices of other people. I am centering circumstances which can go up and down. I am centering my fear. And this is a daily, moment by moment discipline of welcoming the Spirit and allowing the Spirit to draw my focus and center a God of grace. And it makes all the difference. And this is what we practice in worship. Years ago, and I've lived in 4 presbyteries. I'm not going to tell you what church it was or anything like that. Years ago, I was talking to someone who had a mission. They were working very, very hard, and they were concerned about their mission, and they were looking for other people to take it over or work on it. And so I'm like, mission, boy, it's doing really good work. How can I help? Can we be a part of this? Blah, blah, blah. And then I found out their mission met during their worship service. So they did not go to their church's worship service because they were doing mission and they needed to do mission. And I kind of felt like, golly, that just doesn't seem right to me. As much as I exalt mission, I just kind of felt like, I don't think that makes sense. And now it's always stuck with me across the years. And I thought, I think I know why they seemed exhausted. I think I know why they were frazzled. And I think I'm going to always commit myself and you guys, Discovery, to worship, to center ourselves on worship. And that may sound wasteful or anti-mission. How dare you worship? You better get to work. Why are you worshiping? I trust worship. I trust worship. Worship centers us on the God of grace. If it's quality worship that we learn from the Bible, from the Book of Order, from our theology and traditions, worship the God of grace. And this thing we do on Sunday that we call worship, it disciplines and shows all of us. It helps us get off the anxiety, the fear, the nonsense, and hopefully centers us on this God of grace who loves us. And I know society, a lot of places don't value worship or what they're worshiping. I do not know. Whatever. Here at Discovery, we worship the God of grace. And it's a thing, and we do it here on Sundays, and maybe we find other ways, middle of the week, to draw us into this focus on the God of grace. And it corrects our worship of other things, our worship of fear, our worship of money, our worship of appearances, our worship of power, even our worship of country. We center ourselves on the God of grace across all time and space, who calls us into this way of being. And from worship, our centering in a God of grace, we, oh my gosh, in this radical, holy, amazing act, which is a party, we get our purpose. It's not striving, it's not inventing, it's not, let's do mission, don't we look great? It's worship and listening. And God will show us what we're supposed to do. Let's trust that. One of Discovery's 4 covenant principles is we are Christ-centered. Let's embrace that and let it impact our lives. To God be the glory. Amen.